Jake Morrison stood in the cold metal room with his hands locked behind his back and his face hard as stone, while 5 judges in dark blue uniforms stared down at him from their high seats, like angry gods ready to pass judgment on a man who had already decided he regretted nothing about what he had done 3 weeks ago on Kepler Station. The biggest judge was a woman with gray hair and cold eyes who spoke first, and her voice cut through the silence like a blade through flesh when she said that Jake had destroyed an entire building full of important alien visitors who had come to talk about peace and trade between their worlds and Earth. Jake remembered every second of that day when the Zephyrian ambassador with his long neck and purple skin had smiled that terrible smile and said in his smooth voice that humans were nothing but violent animals who would soon die out because the galaxy had no place for such primitive creatures, and the other aliens around the table had nodded and laughed like they were talking about cleaning up garbage. The red anger had filled Jake's mind like fire, and his enhanced muscles had moved before his brain could stop them, and he had grabbed the nearest mining tool and started tearing through the building's walls and support beams, while aliens screamed and ran in all directions, and security guards shot at him with weapons that barely scratched his reinforced skin. When the smoke cleared and the dust settled, Jake had been standing in a pile of twisted metal and broken concrete, with 300 alien diplomats staring at him in fear and horror, while his commanding officers shouted orders through their communication devices and tried to figure out how one angry human soldier had just destroyed the most important peace meeting in 50 years. The gray-haired judge kept talking about how Jake's actions had embarrassed Earth in front of the entire Galactic Council, and how the alien governments were now threatening to cut off all trade and maybe even attack human colonies unless Earth proved it could control its violent citizens by punishing Jake in the harshest way possible. Jake's lawyer was a thin man with nervous hands who kept shuffling papers and clearing his throat while he tried to explain that Jake had been under extreme stress and that humans sometimes acted without thinking when they felt threatened. But the judges did not seem interested in excuses or explanations. The second judge was an old man with a white beard who read from a long list of laws that Jake had broken, including destruction of diplomatic property and assault on foreign officials, and creating an interstellar incident that could lead to war between species and threatening the safety and security of every human being in the galaxy. Jake had heard these same words before from other officers and politicians who visited him in his cell during the past 3 weeks, and they all said the same things about how his moment of anger had put Earth in terrible danger, and how the alien governments were demanding justice, and how Earth had to show that it could be trusted to keep its people under control. The third judge was a younger woman who seemed almost sad when she talked about how Jake had served his country well for 15 years and had fought in 3 different wars against alien raiders who attacked human ships and colonies, but that his good service could not excuse what he had done at Kepler Station. Jake thought about all the battles he had fought, and all the friends he had lost, and all the times he had risked his life to protect human civilians from alien attacks, and how none of that seemed to matter now, because he had finally gotten angry enough to fight back against aliens who wanted to wipe out his entire species. The fourth judge was another old man who explained that the Galactic Council had suggested several different punishments, including execution or permanent exile to a prison planet at the edge of known space, but that Earth's government had negotiated for a different kind of sentence that would satisfy the aliens while keeping Jake alive. The fifth judge was the one who finally said the word that Jake had been expecting to hear since the moment he woke up in his cell 3 weeks ago, and that word was Cryo-Prison, which meant being frozen solid for 100 years while his body stayed alive but his mind stayed asleep, like being dead but not quite dead enough. Jake had heard about Cryo-Prison before and knew that most aliens could not survive the freezing and thawing process because their bodies were too weak, but humans were different and stronger and more stubborn than other species, and Earth's scientists had tested the process on volunteers and found that enhanced soldiers like Jake had an even better chance of surviving. The gray-haired judge explained that 100 years in Cryo-Prison would give the galaxy time to forget about what Jake had done and would show the alien governments that Earth was serious about punishing its violent citizens, and by the time Jake woke up, the political situation would be different and maybe better. Jake listened to all of this without saying a word, because he knew that nothing he said would change their minds, and he also knew that the real reason they were freezing him was not to punish him, but to make him disappear so that Earth could pretend that humans like him did not exist anymore. When they asked if he had anything to say before they passed their final sentence, Jake looked each judge in the eyes and said in a voice as cold as the cryopod that would soon hold him that he was not sorry for what he had done and that if he had the chance he would do it again, because someone needed to remind the aliens that humans were not going to roll over and die just because it made things easier for politicians. The judges did not like his answer, but they had already made their decision, and within an hour, Jake was being walked down a long white hallway toward the cryo facility, while guards in black uniforms marched beside him and scientists in white coats prepared the machines that would freeze him solid for the next century. The cryopod looked like a metal coffin with tubes and wires connected to every surface, and Jake had to strip off his clothes and put on a thin medical suit that felt cold against his skin, while the scientists attached monitoring devices to his arms and chest and head. The lead scientist was a nervous woman who kept checking her instruments and telling Jake that the process would not hurt and that he would fall asleep quickly and wake up feeling like no time had passed at all. But Jake could see the worry in her eyes because she knew that freezing a human for 100 years was still experimental and dangerous. Jake lay down in the cold pod and felt the metal against his back, while the scientists made their final adjustments and prepared to close the lid and begin the freezing process that would either preserve him for a century or kill him in the next few minutes. As the lid started to close, Jake made a promise to himself that if he survived the next 100 years and woke up in a world where humans had forgotten how to fight, then he would remind them what it meant to be human and what it cost to let aliens push them around. The cold began to fill his veins like ice water, and his thoughts started to slow down and fade away, but his anger stayed burning hot in the center of his chest like a flame that could not be frozen, no matter how cold they made his body. The last thing Jake Morrison remembered before the darkness took him was the feeling of that anger settling deep into his bones, where it would wait for 100 years until he opened his eyes again and showed the galaxy that some humans never learned to stay down. The first thing Jake Morrison felt when his mind started working again was the taste of metal in his mouth and the sound of machines humming all around him like mechanical insects buzzing in the walls. And the second thing he felt was that his body was different somehow, stronger and more alive than it had been before they put him in the frozen sleep. Warm air flowed into his lungs, and his heart began to beat faster as feeling returned to his arms and legs and fingers and toes, while the cryopod opened with a long hiss of escaping gas that smelled like chemicals and medicine, and something else that might have been time itself. Jake sat up slowly and tested his muscles by flexing his hands and rolling his shoulders and moving his neck from side to side, and everything worked perfectly. But there was something new in the way his body responded to his commands, as if the 100 years of frozen sleep had somehow made his enhanced soldier modifications even stronger. The room around him looked nothing like the cryo facility where they had put him to sleep, and instead of the white walls and simple machines he remembered, there were now curved surfaces that glowed with soft blue light and floating displays that showed information in languages he did not recognize. A small robot with 6 arms and a round body drifted over to his pod and spoke to him in perfect English, even though its voice sounded like it was coming from inside a metal tube when it said that prisoner number 7743, known as Jake Morrison, had completed his sentence and that an integration counselor would arrive soon to help him adjust to life in the year 2387. Jake climbed out of the pod and stood on legs that felt steady and strong despite having been frozen for a century, and he looked around the room for any sign of human guards or workers, but saw only more robots and automated systems that seemed to be running the entire facility without any living creatures to supervise them. 20 minutes later, a young woman with brown hair and kind eyes walked into the room carrying a thin device that projected holographic charts and documents into the air between them. And she introduced herself as Dr. Lisa Carter and said she was there to help Jake understand how much the world had changed during his long sleep. Lisa Carter looked like she might have been born 50 years after Jake went into Cryo-Prison, and she had the soft look of someone who had never been in a real fight or seen the kind of violence that Jake remembered from his military service, and when she smiled, it was the sort of gentle expression that made Jake want to warn her about how dangerous the galaxy could be. She began by explaining that it was now the year 2387, which meant that Jake had been frozen for exactly 200 years instead of the 100 years that the judges had sentenced him to serve, and she said this had happened because of some legal complications with the Galactic Council that had required extending his sentence. Jake asked what kind of legal complications could keep a man frozen for an extra century, and Lisa's smile became a little less certain as she explained that there had been several diplomatic incidents involving other human prisoners, and that the alien governments had insisted on longer sentences to make sure that violent humans stayed locked away until they could be properly rehabilitated. The word rehabilitated made Jake's enhanced muscles tense up because he had heard that word before from people who wanted to change the way soldiers thought and acted and make them into something softer and more acceptable to civilians who did not understand what it took to keep humanity safe from alien threats. Lisa continued talking about how much the galaxy had changed and how humanity had learned to work better with other species through careful diplomacy and cultural exchange programs and trade agreements that benefited everyone, and Jake listened to every word while a cold feeling grew in his stomach. She showed him holographic displays of Earth and the Moon, which still looked the same as he remembered. But when he asked about the human colonies on other worlds, Lisa hesitated for just a moment before explaining that humanity had consolidated its holdings for greater efficiency and better resource management. Jake knew enough about military language to understand that consolidation usually meant retreat, and that efficiency often meant giving up territory to avoid fighting for it. And he asked Lisa directly how many worlds humans controlled now compared to when he had been frozen. The hesitation lasted longer this time, and Lisa looked down at her device before admitting that humans now held sovereignty over Earth and Luna and several research stations scattered throughout what she called friendly systems, which Jake translated to mean systems controlled by aliens who let humans live there as long as they followed alien rules. Jake asked what had happened to New Texas and Harmony Colony and the mining worlds in the Kepler system and the agricultural planets that had fed the human fleet, and Lisa's kind expression became genuinely sad as she explained that most of those worlds had been transferred to alien control as part of peace agreements that prevented larger conflicts she tried to make. It sounded positive by talking about how many human lives had been saved by avoiding wars and how the remaining human populations were safer and more prosperous than ever before, but Jake could hear the hollow sound in her voice that meant she was repeating words she had been taught to say, rather than expressing what she really believed. Jake stood up and walked to the window, which showed him a view of space that looked wrong somehow, until he realized that the stars were in different positions. Then he remembered, and that the space station where he was being held was not orbiting Earth, but some other world that he did not recognize. Lisa followed him to the window and pointed out various landmarks, including a massive alien structure that, she said, was the new Galactic Council headquarters and several other installations that belonged to different alien species who were now humanity's partners and protectors in maintaining peace and stability throughout the sector. The word protectors made Jake's jaw clench because he remembered when humans had been the ones doing the protecting, And when alien species had feared human ships and human soldiers and human engineering, instead of treating them like junior partners who needed supervision, Jake asked Lisa what had happened to the human military, and she explained that most of the fleet had been decommissioned as part of the peace agreements and that the remaining ships were used mainly for exploration and scientific research under the guidance of alien advisors who helped ensure that humans did not accidentally create new diplomatic problems. She talked about how wonderful it was that humans no longer had to worry about defending themselves because the Galactic Council now provided security for all member species and how human aggression incidents had dropped to almost zero over the past century, which she seemed to think was a great achievement. Jake listened to all of this while his enhanced senses picked up details that Lisa probably did not notice, including the fact that her clothes were made from cheap materials that suggested humans were not as prosperous as she claimed, and that her nervous gestures indicated she was afraid of something, even though she was trying to hide it. When Lisa finished her explanation, Jake asked her one more question, which was whether she thought humanity was better off now than it had been 200 years ago, and the long pause before she answered told him everything he needed to know about what had really happened while he was sleeping. Lisa finally said that humanity was definitely safer now, and that safety was the most important thing, but Jake could hear the doubt in her voice and see the way her eyes avoided his when she said it, and he realized that she was trying to convince herself as much as she was trying to convince him. Jake thanked Lisa for the information and told her he was ready to begin his integration into this new world, and she seemed relieved that he was being so cooperative and reasonable about learning how much everything had changed during his 2 centuries of frozen sleep. But inside his chest, Jake could feel the same cold anger that had sent him into Cryo-Prison beginning to warm up again as he started to understand that humanity had not just lost a war while he was sleeping, but had surrendered without even fighting, and had traded their strength and independence for the promise of safety under alien protection. As Lisa gathered her holographic displays and prepared to leave, Jake made another promise to himself, which was that he would find out exactly what had happened to his species during the past 2 centuries, and then he would decide what to do about the aliens who had convinced humans to give up everything that had made them strong. The integration process was supposed to take several weeks, but Jake had a feeling it would not take him nearly that long to decide that he did not want to be integrated into a galaxy where humans had forgotten how to fight back against anyone who tried to make them smaller and weaker and more afraid. Jake Morrison spent exactly 3 days in the integration facility on Luna before he decided that he had heard enough lies about how wonderful life had become for humanity under alien protection, and on the 4th morning he walked through the facility's security systems like they were made of paper and took a small transport ship from the docking bay while alarms screamed behind him. The security guards who tried to stop him moved too slowly, and their weapons were designed for normal humans rather than enhanced soldiers who had somehow become even stronger during 2 centuries of cryo-sleep, and Jake left them unconscious but alive because they were still human even if they had forgotten what that used to mean. The transport ship was a simple cargo hauler with basic navigation systems and enough fuel to reach several nearby star systems, and Jake programmed it to take him to New Texas because he wanted to see for himself what had happened to the colony world that had once been humanity's proudest achievement in space. During the 3-day journey, Jake studied the ship's computer files and learned more about the galaxy than Lisa Carter had been willing to tell him, including the fact that human territory had shrunk by 70% over the past 2 centuries, and that most of the remaining human populations lived on worlds that were officially controlled by alien governments. The files also contained news reports and historical documents that told the story of how humanity had gradually given up more and more of their independence in exchange for peace treaties and trade agreements that always seemed to benefit the alien species more than they benefited humans. Jake read about the Great Compromise of 2212, when Earth's government had agreed to limit human military expansion in exchange for alien protection from raiders and pirates, and how that agreement had led to bigger compromises that eventually left humanity dependent on alien goodwill for their survival. He also read about other humans who had been put in cryo-prison for various crimes against alien species, and how their sentences had been extended or modified whenever the political situation required more demonstrations of human cooperation, and Jake realized that he was probably not the only soldier who had been kept frozen longer than originally planned. When the transport ship finally reached New Texas, Jake could see immediately that something was wrong, because the orbital stations that had once bustled with human trade ships and military vessels were now dominated by alien craft with strange designs and unfamiliar energy signatures that made his enhanced senses feel uncomfortable. The planet itself still looked beautiful, with its red deserts and blue oceans and white polar caps, but the cities had changed and grown in ways that seemed more suited to alien needs than human preferences, and Jake could see massive structures that had definitely not been built by human engineers. Jake landed his stolen ship at a small commercial port on the edge of the main city and walked through streets that felt familiar but wrong, like visiting a childhood home that had been redecorated by strangers who did not understand what had made it special in the first place. The humans he saw on the streets moved differently than he remembered, with their heads down and their shoulders hunched and their voices quiet when they spoke to each other. And Jake noticed that they seemed to step aside automatically whenever alien pedestrians approached, as if they had been trained to get out of the way. Jake found his way to the main spaceport, where he hoped to locate some of his old military contacts, and after asking several nervous human workers, he finally learned that Commander Pete Rodriguez was still alive and working as a dock supervisor for something called the Zephyrian Trade Consortium. Pete Rodriguez had been Jake's friend for 15 years before the cryo-prison sentence, and they had fought together in 3 different wars against alien raiders who had attacked human colonies and ships throughout the sector, and Jake remembered Pete as a tough soldier who never backed down from a fight. But the man Jake found working in the spaceport's cargo bay looked 20 years older than he should have, and his movements were slow and careful, like someone who had learned to avoid drawing attention to himself, and when he saw Jake, his expression went through surprise and fear and something that might have been hope. Pete looked around nervously before pulling Jake into a small office where they could talk privately, and his first words were to ask if Jake was real or some kind of alien trick designed to test his loyalty to the new government arrangements that kept humans safe but powerless. Jake convinced Pete that he was real by sharing memories from their old military service that no alien could have known, and Pete's face went through several different emotions before settling on a kind of bitter sadness that made Jake want to punch something hard enough to break it. Pete explained that New Texas had been officially transferred to Zephyrian control 15 years ago as part of a trade agreement that was supposed to bring prosperity and stability to the sector, but that in practice meant humans now worked for alien bosses who paid them just enough to survive, but not enough to leave. The human population had dropped from 12 million to 3 million over the past century as people moved away to look for better opportunities or simply gave up and stopped having children because they could not see any future worth fighting for in a galaxy where humans were treated like second-class citizens. Pete told Jake about the quota systems that limited how much humans could earn and the travel restrictions that made it difficult for humans to move between worlds without alien permission, and the education programs that taught human children to be grateful for alien protection instead of proud of human achievements. Jake listened to all of this while his anger grew hotter and more focused, because Pete was describing exactly the kind of systematic oppression that Jake had spent his military career fighting against, except now it was happening to his own species, and most humans seemed to have accepted it as normal. Pete also told Jake about the other veterans from their old unit, and how some had died in accidents that might not have been accidents, and how others had disappeared after asking too many questions about human rights and alien policies, and how the survivors had learned to keep their heads down and their mouths shut. Jake asked Pete what had happened to the weapons caches and supply depots that the human military had hidden throughout the sector as backup plans in case of invasion or occupation, and Pete's expression became even more bitter as he explained that most of those sites had been discovered and destroyed by alien security forces working with human collaborators. But Pete also told Jake that some of the hidden weapons were still out there waiting for someone with the right access codes and the courage to use them, and that there were humans throughout the galaxy who remembered what their species used to be capable of before they learned to be afraid of their own strength. Jake spent 3 more days on New Texas, talking to other humans and learning more about how completely their situation had deteriorated while he was sleeping, and every conversation made him angrier and more determined to do something about what had been done to his people. He met Doc, workers who had once been starship engineers and shopkeepers, who had once been military officers and teachers who were not allowed to mention human history or human achievements in their classes, because such topics were considered inflammatory and potentially dangerous to interspecies harmony. Jake also met younger humans who had never known anything except alien rule, and who seemed genuinely confused when he tried to explain what humanity had been like when they controlled their own destiny and made their own decisions about war and peace and trade and exploration. On his last night on New Texas, Jake stood on the roof of Pete's apartment building and looked up at stars that had once seemed full of human potential and promise, but now looked cold and distant and hostile, like they belonged to someone else who had no interest in sharing them with a species that had forgotten how to fight for what they wanted. Jake made a decision that night, which was that he would not accept the galaxy that humans had built for themselves during his 2 centuries of sleep, and that he would find a way to remind his species and every alien government what humans had been capable of before they decided that safety was more important than freedom. The next morning, Jake said goodbye to Pete and promised that things would change soon, and Pete looked at him with an expression that was part fear and part desperate hope, and told him to be careful because the galaxy was not the same place it had been 200 years ago. Jake smiled and told Pete that the galaxy was about to learn that some things never changed and that human anger was one of those things, and then he walked back to his stolen transport ship and began planning his war against the alien governments that had turned his species into servants and refugees in their own galaxy. Jake Morrison began his war against alien oppression quietly and carefully, because he had learned during his military service that the best way to fight a larger enemy was to make them afraid and confused before they realized they were under attack, and during his first month of freedom, he struck at targets that would send a message without causing massive casualties. His first target was a Zephyrian tax collection station in the Kepler system where alien bureaucrats forced human colonists to pay tribute for the privilege of living on worlds their ancestors had terraformed and built with their own hands and sweat and blood. Jake infiltrated the station during a shift change when security was lightest and used his enhanced strength to tear apart the computer systems that tracked human payments and stored records of who owed what to the alien government, and he made sure to leave evidence that the sabotage had been done by human hands. The second target was a Corvani patrol ship that had been harassing human cargo vessels and demanding bribes for safe passage through space that had once been protected by human warships, and Jake disabled the ship's engines and weapons while it was docked for repairs and left the crew stranded but alive. Jake's third operation was more ambitious and involved redirecting a convoy of supply ships that were carrying food and medicine from human worlds to alien military bases and instead delivering those supplies to human colonies that had been suffering under the quota systems that limited how much they could produce for their own use. Each attack was planned carefully to minimize alien casualties while maximizing the disruption to the systems that kept humans under control. And Jake made sure that every operation could be traced back to human resistance so that the alien governments would know they were dealing with organized opposition rather than random accidents. But Jake knew that small acts of sabotage would not be enough to change the fundamental balance of power in the galaxy, and that he needed to make a statement dramatic enough to inspire other humans to remember their own strength and stand up against the aliens who had convinced them to accept slavery disguised as protection. The opportunity came when Jake learned about a major trade conference scheduled to take place at Centauri Station, where representatives from 12 different alien species would meet with human colonial administrators to discuss new restrictions on human industrial production and population growth. Jake spent 2 weeks studying the station's layout and security systems and learning the schedules of everyone who would be attending the conference, and he realized that this would be the perfect place to remind the galaxy what humans were capable of when they stopped trying to be diplomatic and polite. On the day of the conference, Jake walked into the main assembly hall wearing a modified version of his old military combat suit that he had reconstructed using parts stolen from various alien installations and weapons depots during his month of sabotage operations. The aliens in the hall were discussing new quotas that would reduce human food production by 20% and limit human families to 1 child per household in order to prevent overpopulation problems that might strain the resources of alien protector governments. Jake stood quietly in the back of the hall and listened to the Zephyrian Trade Minister explain how these new restrictions would benefit everyone by creating more stability and reducing the potential for human unrest that could threaten the peace and prosperity that had been achieved through careful cooperation between species. The human representatives sat at a small table off to one side and nodded politely while the aliens made decisions about their people's future, and Jake could see the resignation and defeat in their faces, and the way they had learned to smile and agree with whatever their alien masters told them to do. When the Zephyrian minister asked if anyone had questions or concerns about the new restrictions, Jake raised his hand and spoke in a voice loud enough to carry throughout the entire hall when he said that he had a complaint about the way humans were being treated. The alien delegates barely looked in his direction, and the Zephyrian minister dismissed him with a wave of his long purple hand and said that human concerns would be addressed after the primary business was finished and that Jake should wait his turn, like a good citizen. Jake smiled and said that he had been waiting for 200 years and that he thought that was long enough, and then he activated his combat suit's power systems and began systematically destroying the conference hall while the aliens scrambled for the exits. Jake did not try to hurt anyone during what became known throughout the galaxy as the Centauri demonstration, but he made sure that every alien delegate understood exactly how much damage one angry human could cause when he stopped pretending to be civilized and cooperative. He tore through the station's bulkheads with his bare hands and ripped apart the artificial gravity generators and atmospheric recycling systems and power distribution networks, while his suit's speakers broadcast a message explaining that humans were tired of being treated like children who needed alien supervision. The message also announced that there were thousands of other enhanced human soldiers sleeping in cryopods throughout the galaxy, and that they would eventually wake up and discover what had been done to their species while they were frozen, and that they would not be happy. About what they found, Jake finished his demonstration by redirecting the station's main power core into a spectacular fireworks display that could be seen from several light-years away, and then he escaped in a stolen alien shuttle while emergency teams tried to figure out how much damage one human had caused in less than 30 minutes. News of the Centauri demonstration spread throughout human space within days, and Jake began receiving messages from humans on dozens of different worlds, who wanted to know if the stories were true and whether there really was someone fighting back against the alien governments that had made their lives so small and fearful. Jake responded to these messages by providing coordinates for hidden weapons, caches that he had learned about from Pete Rodriguez and other veterans, and by sharing technical information about how to sabotage alien monitoring systems and communication networks without getting caught. Within weeks, similar incidents began. occurring on human worlds throughout the galaxy, as ordinary people who had forgotten they knew how to fight began remembering what their species had accomplished before they learned to be afraid of making their alien protectors angry. Jake established a secure communication network that allowed human resistance cells to coordinate their activities and share information about alien weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And slowly, the scattered acts of defiance began to form into something that looked like an organized rebellion. The alien governments responded by increasing security measures and imposing harsher penalties for human resistance activities, but their efforts only served to anger more humans and convince them that their alien protectors were actually their alien oppressors. Jake knew that random acts of sabotage and rebellion would eventually be crushed by superior alien military forces unless he could find a way to strike at the heart of the system that kept humans enslaved, and he began planning an operation that would force the entire galaxy to confront the question of whether humans deserve to be treated as equals or would continue to accept their role as subjects. The target he chose was Zerion Prime, which served as the capital world for the Galactic Council and the center of alien political power throughout known space. And Jake knew that an attack on Zerion Prime would either result in human liberation or human extinction, but that either outcome would be better than the slow death of dignity and pride that his species had been suffering for the past 2 centuries. Jake spent months modifying his stolen transport ship with weapons and defensive systems scavenged from alien installations throughout the galaxy and preparing for what he knew would probably be a one-way mission to remind the universe that humans had never learned how to stay down when someone tried to keep them there. The emergency session of the Galactic Council convened on Zerion Prime 3 months after the Centauri demonstration, with representatives from 57 alien species gathering in the massive crystal dome that served as the center of galactic government to discuss what they called the human terrorist problem. But what Jake Morrison knew was really a debate about whether his species would be allowed to exist at all. Jake Morrison arrived uninvited in his modified transport ship, which now bristled with weapons and shielding systems taken from a dozen different alien vessels he had raided during his months of preparation, and he dropped out of hyperspace directly above the council chambers while planetary defense systems tried, unsuccessfully, to stop him. The alien defense grid had been designed to handle conventional attacks by enemy fleets, but Jake had spent his military career learning how alien technology worked, and human engineering had always excelled at finding creative ways to break things that were supposed to be unbreakable. Jake's ship punched through the defense grid like a bullet through paper and landed in the courtyard outside the council chambers while alien security forces surrounded him with weapons drawn and demanded that he surrender peacefully or face immediate destruction. Jake emerged from his ship wearing his fully modified combat armor that incorporated technology stolen from 6 different alien military systems, and he walked through the security cordon like they were children playing with toys, while their weapons bounced harmlessly off his enhanced shielding. The council chamber fell silent when Jake entered, and every alien representative turned to stare at the human who had single-handedly disrupted their careful plans for dealing with the human resistance movement that had been spreading throughout the galaxy like a virus. Jake stood before the assembled alien leadership and looked around the chamber at creatures from dozens of different worlds who had spent the past 2 centuries convincing themselves that humans were weak and controllable and easy to manage as long as they were kept properly supervised. The Zephyrian delegate who had called for the emergency session tried to speak first, but Jake's enhanced reflexes allowed him to cross the chamber and lift the alien off the ground before security could react, and he held the purple-skinned creature in one hand while addressing the rest of the council. Jake's voice carried throughout the chamber and beyond as the council's broadcasting systems transmitted his words to every corner of the galaxy where humans and aliens alike stopped what they were doing to listen to what he had to say. Jake told them that 200 years ago they had put him in a freezer because he had gotten angry and destroyed a building full of alien diplomats who thought humans were animals that needed to be exterminated, and he said that the aliens had made a mistake. By thinking that time would cool off his anger, he explained that during his frozen sleep, the alien governments had systematically destroyed human independence and turned his species into servants and refugees in their own galaxy, while convincing them that slavery was actually protection and oppression was actually cooperation. Jake set the Zephyrian delegate down carefully, but kept his armor's weapons systems locked onto every alien in the chamber, while he continued speaking about what humans had been like before they learned to be afraid of their own strength. He reminded the council that humans were the species that had turned warfare into an art form and had colonized hostile worlds for the challenge, and had looked at the vast emptiness of space and called it room to grow instead of something to be feared. Jake told them about the human colonies that had been built on worlds where no other species could survive, and the human ships that had explored regions of space that aliens considered too dangerous to enter, and the human soldiers who had fought wars that other species had declared impossible to win. He explained that the aliens had made the mistake of thinking that humans were like other species, and that they would break under pressure and trade their freedom for safety and forget who they used to be if they were pushed hard enough for long enough. Jake removed his helmet so that every alien in the chamber could see his face and understand that. He was still human and still angry and still completely unwilling to accept the galaxy that had been built while he was sleeping. He told them that there were millions of other enhanced soldiers sleeping in cryopods throughout the galaxy, and that they would eventually wake up to discover what had been done to their species, and that every one of them would be just as furious as he was. Jake said that the aliens could choose to work with humans as equals, or they could try to cage them again. But that either way, they needed to understand what they were dealing with because humans were not pets to be domesticated or resources to be managed. He explained that humans were the species that had survived ice ages and plagues and wars and disasters that would have wiped out most other forms of life, and that they had not become the dominant species on their homeworld by being reasonable and cooperative and easy to control. Jake's smile was cold and dangerous as he told the assembled aliens that the age of human diplomacy was over, and that the age of earning respect through strength had begun again, whether the galaxy was ready for it or not. The council session continued for 18 hours, while alien delegates frantically renegotiated humanity's status in galactic civilization, and by the time Jake left Zerion Prime, humans had been granted full species autonomy and territorial sovereignty over their traditional colonies and representation on the Galactic Council. Itself, Jake's ship jumped to hyperspace, carrying news of humanity's restored independence to human worlds throughout the galaxy, where celebrations erupted as people realized that they no longer had to bow their heads and accept whatever their alien protectors decided was best for them. The aliens had learned that keeping humans down required constant vigilance and overwhelming force, and that even then, there was always the risk that someone like Jake Morrison would wake up from a long sleep and remind the galaxy why humans had been feared in the first place. On distant worlds throughout human space, other cryopods began their thawing cycles as automated systems responded to signals broadcast from Jake's ship and other enhanced. Soldiers started stirring from frozen sleep with the same burning anger that had driven Jake to reshape the balance of power in the galaxy. The humans were waking up after 2 centuries of forced sleep, and they were discovering that their species had traded strength for safety and independence for protection and dignity for survival, and none of them were happy about what they found. Jake Morrison had kept his promise to make the aliens pay for what they had done. But more importantly, he had reminded humanity that some things were worth fighting for, even if the fight seemed impossible to win. The galaxy was about to rediscover why humans had earned their reputation as the most stubborn and dangerous species in known space, and why putting them in freezers only made them angrier when they finally thawed out and realized what had been done while they were sleeping. In the depths of space, thousands of cryopods hummed with the vibrations of revival cycles as enhanced soldiers. and pilots and engineers and Marines began the slow process of returning to consciousness after centuries of frozen dreams filled with memories of what humanity used to be. They were waking up to a galaxy that had changed, but they were still the same humans who had conquered their homeworld and reached for the stars and refused to stay down no matter how many times someone tried to keep them there. Jake Morrison had started something that would reshape the galaxy because he had proven that human anger was patient and persistent and impossible to freeze no matter how long you kept it locked away in the dark.